In 1808, French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte launched a campaign against Spain, a nation that had until then been one of France's closest allies. However, Napoleon perceived Spain as a backward country, dominated by religious fervor and governed by an inept and dissolute monarchy. His ambition was to dismantle these corrupt institutions and impose the progressive reforms of Napoleonic rule: modernization, administrative efficiency, and rational governance. Yet, the Spanish people, deeply devout and fiercely loyal, responded with unyielding resistance. The result was a brutal conflict that raged for nearly 6 years, claiming the lives of 500,000 people and contributing significantly to the downfall of Napoleon's empire. For the Spanish, it became known as the War of Independence. For their British allies, it was the Peninsular War. These are the voices of those who witnessed those momentous days. In the spring of 1808, French troops, ostensibly Spain's allies, surreptitiously occupied numerous Spanish cities. But as it became clear that Napoleon intended to depose the Spanish royal family, resistance swiftly mounted. On May 2nd in Madrid, tensions between locals and French soldiers erupted into open violence, a day immortalized as Dos de Mayo. A local priest recounted the uprising, blinded by rage and fury. Some fired upon the French from windows and street corners. Others hurled themselves into the fray with reckless abandon. Still others rained stones, furniture, and household objects from balconies, where they were joined by women armed with cauldrons of scalding water. It seemed as though not a single soul in the city was unwilling to drench the streets with French blood, even at the cost of their own lives. Despite the fierce resistance, French casualties in the uprising were relatively light: 31 dead and 114 wounded. However, the brutal reprisals that followed set the tone for the savage conflict to come. Around 300 Spanish prisoners were summarily executed, marking the beginning of a war fought with relentless cruelty on both sides. As Napoleon declared that his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, would ascend the Spanish throne, fighting engulfed the country. In Zaragoza, civilians and soldiers alike united to defend their city from the French onslaught. At around 1 o'clock, a defender recalled, French troops approached the city, and we immediately opened fire. What followed was an extraordinary display of valor from the people of Zaragoza. Few events in history can compare. When the French breached the walls, men and women alike rushed to meet them with nothing but their own bodies for protection, forcing them to retreat under a relentless storm of bullets. Captain Murazinski, a Polish officer in Napoleon's army, participated in the assault. A vicious battle began, and for the first time, the defenders of Zaragoza saw their enemies falter. This emboldened them, and crowds of them charged toward the gates. From the windows and rooftops, unseen snipers poured musket fire upon our troops, who had no means of retaliation. With bullets cutting through our ranks from every direction, General Lefebvre realized the futility of pressing forward and ordered a retreat. The city was in chaos, yet this did nothing to dampen the sheer heroism of its people. This was especially true of the women, who from the outset ensured that the defenders had water, wine, and brandy. They moved among the fighters, lifting their spirits and urging them on against an enemy as relentless as he was ruthless. The devastation we suffered was immense. By that summer, Napoleon's most persistent foe, Britain, dispatched reinforcements to aid Spain and Portugal, which had also fallen under French occupation. In July, approximately 14,000 British troops landed at Mondego Bay. Among them was Private Harris of the 95th Rifles, who found himself thrust into combat at Rolica mere days after disembarking. The Rifles fought bravely that day, though we lost many men. Joseph Calcombe stood beside me, loading and firing with great diligence. Overcome with heat and thirst from the battle, he raised his canteen to his lips. "Here's to you, old boy," he said. At that moment, a bullet pierced his canteen and struck his skull, killing him instantly. Another man fell beside him, shot through the thigh. The carnage was terrible. I saw a man named Simmons take a cannonball directly to the face, He dropped to the ground, a headless corpse. Both British and French regiments were accompanied by women who served as laundresses, nurses, and, in many cases, wives to the soldiers. These women understood that every battle could bring devastating news. When the roll was called after the battle, the women who had lost their husbands walked along the front line, desperately inquiring about their fate. Among the names called, I heard Calcombe spoken by a woman's trembling voice. No answer came. Watching the poor, sobbing creature before me, I found myself unable to deliver the dreadful truth. Yet for all the horrors of battle, it was the relentless guerrilla warfare waged by Spanish and Portuguese partisans that struck the greatest fear into the French. Convoys and couriers were particularly vulnerable to ambush, forcing them to travel only under heavy escort. One such courier, Captain Marbeau, was dispatched on a critical night mission with urgent dispatches. What awaited him was the unseen, ruthless vengeance of a people who refused to submit. The officer commanding our advance guard provided me with a troop horse and 2 orderlies, and I set off under the brilliance of the moonlight. After traveling 2 or 3 leagues, we suddenly heard musket fire, and bullets whistled perilously close past us. The assailants remained unseen, concealed among the rocks. Yet the most harrowing fate was not death, but capture by the guerrillas. A little farther on, we stumbled upon the corpses of 2 French soldiers, freshly slain. They had been stripped of all possessions, but their shackles lay nearby, a chilling reminder of their fate. Pressing onward, we encountered a ghastly sight. A young officer of the 10th Regiment, still clad in his uniform, had been crucified, his hands and feet nailed to a barn door, his body suspended. Upside down, beneath him, a small fire smoldered. Aperine, his agony had been ended by death. Yet, as his blood still trickled from open wounds, it was evident that his executioners were not far away. Such horrifying discoveries ignited fierce French reprisals, fueling a relentless cycle of brutality on both sides. On another occasion, a few grenadiers and a female canteen keeper, having fallen behind, sought shelter for the night in a village. The following morning, they were assigned a local guide, who led them straight into an ambush. There, they were butchered with merciless cruelty. Upon learning of this atrocity, the battalion commander retaliated, marching on the village, razing it to the ground, and rounding up all able-bodied men. He declared that unless the culprits were revealed, they would all face execution, for refused to confess and were summarily shot. The 5th, however, betrayed the murderers who were among them. They too were immediately executed. Determined to rid the region of these relentless raiders, elite French companies were assembled to drive them out. We pursued them to a fortified town called Alcanes, where they had barricaded themselves. After an intense battle, we stormed the town, which was then handed over for plunder. The ensuing carnage was indiscriminate. Every inhabitant was slaughtered, and everything of value was looted. We remained there for 6 weeks, enduring repeated attacks by the guerrillas, who, despite their efforts, could not dislodge us. However, whenever they captured one of our own, the torment they inflicted was beyond comprehension. Prisoners suffered gruesome fates, tongues and fingernails torn out, bodies roasted alive. In 1809, a British naval officer witnessed the French sack the Spanish town of Corcubion from aboard his ship. We watched as French troops surged into the miserable town from both sides of the valley. Many inhabitants, in sheer panic, rushed to the fishing boats along the shore, hurling themselves aboard in a desperate attempt to escape. As we rowed into the harbor, we encountered hundreds of these wretched souls, half-dressed, screaming, fighting to flee beyond the reach of gunfire. Others scrambled up the hillsides toward the bay, hoping to be rescued by boats or to conceal themselves among the rocks. Many of these fugitives were cut down by enemy fire before they could reach safety. So completely surrounded were these helpless civilians that escape was nearly impossible. The horror and chaos of the spectacle were only magnified by the sight of the town in flames, its streets the setting of even greater atrocities. The war in Spain had begun as a disaster for the French. Facing relentless and unexpected resistance, Napoleon was forced to intervene personally, bringing massive reinforcements. Spanish armies were crushed. Their British allies, overwhelmed, were forced into a desperate winter retreat through the mountains, struggling toward the nearest port. It became a battle for sheer survival. The burden we carried was too great, recalled one retreating soldier. We staggered on, our gaze fixed straight ahead. If a man collapsed, he had little hope of rising again unless a comrade helped him, and many perished from sheer exhaustion. As for myself, I was nearly broken by this march. Upon reaching a town, which I believe was Zamora, I collapsed at the entrance of the first street. My vision blurred, my head spun, and I dropped as though struck dead. At times, I was certain the enemy was close behind us. I could swear I heard their trumpets carried on the wind. As dusk fell, he encountered a heart-wrenching scene. I remember passing a man and a woman lying clasped in each other's arms, dying together in the snow. I knew them both, but there was no way to help them. Despite suffering heavy losses, the British forces managed to escape by sea. Later that year, under the command of the future Duke of Wellington, they regrouped alongside the Spanish and inflicted a significant defeat on the French at the Battle of Talavera. Lieutenant Simmons of the 95th Rifles, who arrived too late for the battle, described the battlefield's ghastly aftermath. The horrors before me were beyond imagination. Thousands of corpses strewn in every direction. French and British soldiers, men and horses alike, lay in great heaps, having cut each other down. To my dismay, I witnessed Spanish troops butchering wounded Frenchmen whenever the opportunity arose, stripping them of their clothing. Left exposed, the bodies became prey to swarms of relentless flies and the merciless heat of the midday sun. Captured soldiers faced grim fates in a war where all sides were plagued by dire shortages of food and water. Spanish private one Manuel Sarraza, taken prisoner near Badajoz in 1811, recalled his harrowing ordeal. The journey was conducted in the most wretched manner imaginable. It truly seemed as if they wished to let us perish from hunger. Each morning, as we set out, we left behind the lifeless bodies of comrades who had succumbed during the night. From the rear of the column came a relentless staccato of gunfire. It was the French executing those too weak to continue. Emaciated, reduced to mere shadows of men, we did all we could to support each other. To fall behind meant certain death. We had no choice but to abandon our friends and bid them farewell forever. By then, Napoleon had already left Spain, never to return. His attention had shifted to Central Europe and soon to his ill-fated invasion of Russia. The French forces he left behind in Spain, stretched thin and poorly supported, were left to their fate in a war they could no longer hope to win. It was a grim predicament for the once proud soldiers of the Grande Armée, including Colonel who in 1811 found himself among those retreating from Portugal under Marshal Massena's command. Our situation was dire. Supplies were practically non-existent. We lacked food, clothing, boots, money, and even horses. 6 months of deprivation in a land stripped bare of resources had not dampened the army's courage, but had sapped its strength and shattered its discipline. In our wake, we left a trail of misery, and the Portuguese people would curse the name of France for generations. While some among us had upheld the honor of soldiers, others had behaved as brigands, preying upon the helpless peasantry. Thus, when the Portuguese, in turn, displayed brutal savagery towards our wounded and captured comrades, it was understandable, though not justifiable. The failure of this campaign has often been blamed on the commanding general, but this is incorrect. The ultimate responsibility lay with Napoleon himself, who, having willed this war, forced it upon his generals without providing the means to secure victory. Yet, despite their retreat from Portugal, the French army continued to fight with tenacity, as the British would discover the following year when they laid siege to the fortress city of Badajoz. Upon reaching the breach, the French sentry on the wall cried out 3 times, "Que vive or words to that effect. When no reply came, a storm of musket fire, canister, and grape shot rained down upon us, interspersed with blazing fireballs. I was struck twice. Small lead slugs tore in my left knee, while musket balls slammed into my side. By sheer fortune, it first passed through my canteen, creating 2 holes before striking me with reduced force. Despite the pain, I clung to my ladder and pressed forward into the entrenchment. By then, many had already fallen, yet our officer's cry rang out, "Onward, lads!" We surged toward the breach, only to be met with an unexpected and demoralizing obstacle. The chevaux de frise had been firmly set in place, and behind it, a deep entrenchment from which the French garrison poured deadly fire into our ranks. Repeated attempts to remove this infernal barrier were made, and in one such effort, my left hand was slashed terribly by its jagged blades. With no hope of success in that sector, we were forced to withdraw temporarily. My wounds continued to bleed, and I was growing faint. My comrades urged me to make my way to the rear, but this proved an arduous task. Too weak to stand, I crawled on my hands and knees until I was beyond the reach of the enemy's musketry. We pressed forward once more, reaching the breaches, where a scene of unspeakable carnage unfolded before us. The ditch was choked with the dead and dying. If a man was wounded and fell, the odds were overwhelmingly against him ever rising again. The relentless storm of musketry and grape shot transformed the scene into a slaughterhouse. I had witnessed battle before, but never anything of this magnitude. The British assault on Badajoz ultimately succeeded. Its fall cleared the way for Wellington's army to advance into Spain in 1812, culminating in the decisive Battle of Salamanca. Morale among the British was soaring. There had surely never been an army so eager for battle. These were seasoned, battle-hardened soldiers, supremely confident in their leader and utterly convinced of their own invincibility. When the order to advance was given, that confidence was put to a brutal test. The French had positioned their infantry atop a rugged ridge, so precipitous that they could fire from 4 or 5 ranks deep. The fusillade that erupted was the heaviest I had ever experienced, mingled with ceaseless discharges of grape shot. The crest of the hill was a continuous inferno, an unbroken streak of flame. At the very first volley, some 80 men from my regiment's right rear collapsed in a single mass. The commanding officer rode over at once to determine the cause and found them all grievously wounded. The carnage only intensified. A Portuguese cadet, attached to our regiment, was struck by a shell that detonated upon impact, reducing him to a mangled ruin. Another man, hit by grape shot across the abdomen, struggled to hold his intestines in place with both hands. The sheer agony on his face remains seared into my memory. Salamanca was a stunning victory for the Allies. Though Wellington was later forced to withdraw to the Portuguese frontier for the winter, his next advance in 1813 would prove decisive. The French abandoned southern Spain and Madrid, falling back toward Vitoria. Here, King Joseph Bonaparte and Marshal Jourdan made their final stand. Yet, when the Allies launched their attack, the French defense crumbled. We advanced into the chaos, a battery positioned ahead of us, unleashing devastation. Men and officers fell on all sides, their wounds inflicted almost exclusively by cannon fire and shells, save for our colonel, who took a musket ball to the stomach. Our front lines engaged a French regiment positioned to the right of the battery. At first, they fired upon us in disciplined volleys, which we returned in kind. Then, breaking ranks, they retreated into a dense thicket. We pursued them relentlessly, pressing forward with sustained fire until they were utterly routed. Amid the carnage, I came across a grievously wounded French soldier, his voice weak as he pleaded with us not to leave him to the mercy of the Spanish. A cannonball had severed both his thighs. He had at most 2 hours to live. He begged me to stay, but I lingered only briefly. Any sympathy I might have felt was dulled by exhaustion and necessity. Before moving on, I rifled through his pockets and knapsack, uncovering a piece of cooked pork and several pounds of bread. The poor fellow implored me to leave him something, so I cut off a portion of the food and emptied the beans from my haversack, placing them beside him. Then, I pressed on, ascending the hill. For soldiers on the losing side, the aftermath of battle was fraught with fear and uncertainty. Our retreat was a desperate scramble through a battlefield strewn with wreckage, overturned wagons, fallen horses, abandoned cannons. At one point, I crossed a ditch filled with the dead and dying. 2 enemy cavalrymen drew near, and with my ammunition soaked and useless, I had no choice but to shoulder my musket and lower my head, waiting for the inevitable. Yet, inexplicably, they rode past me, intent on cutting down some scattered French survivors instead. Nightfall came, and I was utterly lost. In the darkness, a faint whistle reached my ears. I froze, listening carefully, and heard French being spoken. Somewhere nearby, perhaps hidden among the trees or behind a crumbling wall, my countrymen remained. And so I followed the sound, hoping to find a way to escape the horrors that surrounded me. Several soldiers from the 44th Regiment, belonging to our division, responded to my call for some Allied troops. The aftermath of Vittoria was nothing short of an unexpected windfall, as King Joseph's entire treasury had been abandoned in the chaos of the French retreat. As dusk fell, the head of our column suddenly stumbled upon a line of wagons. Someone shouted, "Money carts!" and in an instant, the entire division dissolved into a frenzy, as though responding to a well-drilled command. The wagon covers were torn away in seconds, and what followed was a spectacle both disgraceful and absurd. Soldiers flung themselves inside, their legs thrashing wildly in the air as hands scrambled in a desperate search for treasure. For money it certainly was. I was ordered to clear one of the wagons, and after considerable effort, I finally succeeded, though by then the riches had all but vanished. To my astonishment, as I peered inside, I discovered an officer at the bottom, his hands brimming with the precious silver. I shall not name either his regiment or his rank. Wellington's victory at Vittoria delivered the final, fatal blow to Napoleon's rule in Spain. Though fierce battles still lay ahead, at San Sebastian and in the Pyrenees, the French defeat was now inevitable. Within months, British, Spanish, and Portuguese forces would cross into France itself. The Peninsular War had been a long and harrowing campaign. Hundreds of thousands had perished, many through violence, but even more from disease. Entire towns and villages had been reduced to ruins, their churches ransacked, their people slaughtered. The scars of war would linger for generations, etched into both the land and the memories of those who had endured it. For Napoleon, the Peninsular War was a catastrophe, an unrelenting drain on his empire and a rare stain on a career otherwise marked by military genius. But if one seeks to understand Napoleon at the height of his brilliance, pushed to his very limits in a desperate struggle for survival, one need look no further than the Battle of Marengo. It was a clash that looms large in Napoleonic legend, yet behind the myth lies a far grittier reality. Join us as we reconstruct Marengo, hour by hour.